and all the activists who are around here in support of justice and human rights in the most beleaguered Sudan. Personal thanks, therefore, and I want to lay out concretely how international policy has approached conflict resolution, peacemaking, and peacekeeping in Sudan, precisely in the way my friends Zainab and Nasruddin have addressed, which is addressing the symptoms rather than the core problem. At the core of all Sudan's conflict are, of course, chronic and structural issues of governance, of lack of tolerance of diversity or of acknowledgement of diversity. At the core of this problem is deeply seated racism, with some Sudanese in the ruling elites believing that they are better human beings than other Sudanese. And as long as these issues are not addressed in their core, conflicts will continue repetition. Now, what are the main weaknesses of international policies towards the resolution of these conflicts? Let's start 10 years back, as we are mandated for this session, international policy. The process that led to the Naivasha process, it was built on sequencing. That is to say, the main mediator, the IGAD, regional organization, and its friends in the international community, who were very well organized and effectively so in the Friends of IGAD Forum, the US, the United Kingdom, and Norway, by providing support for the regional mediator, but leaving the lead to the mediation. They had a policy of really focusing on the North-South axis for resolving the conflict in South Sudan, and then addressing the other conflict that started bubbling up. The future, the constitutional future of the state in Sudan was being decided in Naivasha, in Nairobi, in Kenya, and all the other marginalized regions were not going to sit, sakit, as we say, quietly, while, the future is being decided there. So we saw the eruption of war in Darfur, we saw the eruption of war also in the East, but there was a deliberate decision not to pursue this. The head of UN at the time was touring capitals, trying to alert, Mukesh Kabila was here, my witness, to alert to the disaster that is unfolding at that very moment, and there was no way of diverting attention away from real focus on the North-South. So the negotiations between Northern Sudan and South Sudan to end the civil war there were actually between two ruling parties, both militarized, both ideologically entrenched. However, the ideology of New Sudan, of John Garang, who headed the SPLM, had transcended the North-South divide. And therefore, there were regions in Northern Sudan who fought the war on the side of South Sudan. The negotiations focused on the North-South axis, on the transitional zones to address the grievances of these regions, and therefore we had the three regions, the three areas, and to resolve the root causes, the democratization, the democratic transformation of Sudan. When you look at the implementation during the 6-year transition mandated by the CPA, it was implemented at different speeds, with a lot of focus in pushing for ceasefire, respect, and implementation of security arrangements between the North and the South, less emphasis on the transitional areas, which, the agreement gives them some autonomy, but also promised popular consultations, and no follow-up at all by the IGAD or by the friends of the IGAD, therefore members of the international community, leading among which are the US, for the democratic transformation of Sudan. The government was given free rein to really then indulge into a policy in which it's an excellent performer, divide and rule. The government is not successful in dividing and rule only of its opponents, whether armed insurgents, as is happening with the Darfur movements, but also of political opposition and of the international community. 2006, Khartoum was negotiating with the Eastern Front in Asmara, with the mediation of the government of Eritrea. leading to the Eastern Front, the peace agreement for the East. 2006, it was negotiating with the National Democratic Alliance in Cairo, with the mediation of the intelligence services of Egypt, not the government of Egypt, or Suliman, leading to the agreement, between the government and the NDA. It was negotiating with the rebel movements in Darfur, the Darfur movements in N'Djamena, with the mediation of, a totally sold out mediator to the government of Sudan, Idris Deby at the time. He was actually, the government of Chad actually amended the agreement after its signature to suit demands from the government of Sudan of what should be that agreement. That is how corrupt the system was, at the time. And the Khartoum was allowed to get away with this, with the complicity of the international community. That complicity could be seen in a diplomatic device, which was, then, the Darfur negotiations moved to Abuja, and in Abuja, a lot of pressure was put on the Darfur movement, as explained in earlier discussions. There was a provision for those movements that didn't sign Abuja Agreement, which is called a Declaration of Commitment to Abuja Agreement. For those who are joining the Abuja Agreement and Abuja process after the fact, after signing. And such signatures were endorsed and hosted and sponsored by the African Union with the support of international actors in Addis Ababa. So the government was able to continue the process, feeding and stoking the process of splintering of the Darfur movements by inviting individuals who lost their, real hold on their own troops on the ground, who were tempted by the compensations offered by Khartoum for joining such agreements. And the political process actually added to the phenomena of the splintering of the Darfur movements to a point which made it almost impossible to reach political accommodation, because the Darfur movements were so scattered and divided that it was impossible to have them agree, on a joint negotiating platform, let alone on uniting or really integrating to join the peace process together. As a result of this, Khartoum was able to prevail. We look at what happened after, Addis Ababa and the Declaration of Commitment. The focus of the international community was trying to lead the groups of Darfur movements into, unifying so as to approach the Doha process. Again, the political process was a way of weakening the Darfur movements. Rebel commanders from the front line were flown to Doha by the dozens, by the hundreds, for over the 2 to 3 years that the process lasted. Khartoum was very happy to authorize the United Nations to take them to Doha at the request of the political commanders, but not of giving the same authorization for them to go back to join their troops. So the political process was actually used to siphon out the most effective rebel commanders from the field, and enable Khartoum to prevail on the military side on the ground, while in Doha, the continuous manipulation of the divisions and feeding of new divisions, and at the time, God knows how many dozen rebel factions were formed and dissolved and recommitted, and formed new rebel umbrellas, with the end result that, the integrity, the consistency of the Darfur movements was forever compromised, thanks again to the manipulation of Khartoum of an international diplomatic process. You look at the mediation in Doha, and there is a problem there. Doha, negotiation was led by an envoy who is supposed to be a joint envoy for the United Nations and the African Union, Ambassador Bassoli. It was hosted by the government, very generously, I must admit, of the government of the Emirate of Qatar. In the Arab Muslim world, these are 15 minutes remaining, we need to stop here. Okay. In the Arab world, it was Qatari mediation. No one talks about the United Nations or the African Union. For the African Union, it was Basoli, their person. But the United Nations had a very marginal role in supporting Basoli because the currents were that close. African Union at the same time had a parallel mediation mechanism for Darfur, that of President Mbeki panel. It's a multiple former head of state, but it's known by Mbeki panel. The high, its latest incarnation is the African Union High Implementation Panel for Darfur. It was mandated in 2009 for Darfur, uniquely, and then in 2010 given the mandate to implement its recommendation for Darfur, but also to address implementation of the CPA for the whole Sudan. This is the only official remaining mechanism to resolve the problems of Sudan, North-South, SPLM North with the government, Darfur, everything, the official body today is the Mbeki panel. However, again, Khartoum has managed to divide the international community. At the level of peacekeeping, you have multiple peacekeeping forces, UNIFSA in Abyei, UNAMID in Darfur. Tell me about a country anywhere in the world which has 4 peacekeeping mechanisms for one country. With now South Sudan independent, there is of course a United Nations mission, peacekeeping mission and stabilization mission in South Sudan. But in Northern Sudan, there are 3 United Nations mechanisms that are not allowed to exchange information or intelligence by their agreements with the government, because the government ensured that this does not happen. So I believe everyone has to have a second look at their own performance vis-à-vis the regime in Khartoum. Khartoum is excellent at divide and rule. It has succeeded to exhaustion in dividing the rebel movements in Darfur. It has succeeded in dividing the United Nations, African Union, and within the United Nations, getting what it wanted with regard of making sure that there is not one effective peacekeeping mission that keeps issues of peace and human rights on track in the country. And the challenge, therefore, comes back to the court of the rebel movements in Darfur, for example. As long as I see, 3 movements, even under one umbrella, such as the Sudan Revolutionary Front, but 3 and more rebel, movements speaking on behalf of Darfur, I continue to worry, because they are simply playing in the hands of a very good poker player with these issues. They will continue to divide and prevail. This is what has happened before. This is what will happen again. With regard to international policy, the lesson learned is that you need an integrated process that groups all the mediators with influence in Sudan and on Sudan. And by that I mean the African Union, the United Nations, the other sub-regional bodies, have to agree to some mediation strategy, and countries with influence in the region,
Dr. Suliman,
such as the United States of America and France and Norway and so on. And without that, divide and rule will continue to be the game of derailing all peace efforts in the country. Thank you.